I had to sit down like that because you can't see the graphic when I'm sitting down. But what if I asked you, do you want a tiny Game Boy Color? Do you want a Game Boy Color that plays original hardware and has all the original brains inside it, but it's tiny? No, you guys are always in the comments being like, oh, this thing looks like an ergonomic nightmare. So you don't want it. So I'll just, oh, you do this time. This time you, I will never understand you guys. So fine, we'll do this. I'm your cool Uncle Marissa, and we are gonna put together a Tadboy color. Froggo Customs, also known as Chris, not really sure which one his birth name is the creator behind the Frogboy Color, which I did a video on not too long ago. And the Frogboy Color has been one of my favorite mods to do because I love the horizontal form factor, and putting Game Boy Color in that is a very neat idea. And just the entire build is so delightful that while the Game Boy Advance is already in a horizontal form factor, I will continue until my last breath to bug Chris Customs Frogs to maybe consider at least like shell kind of for Game Boy Advance that's similar. But as he saw that I was making the Frogboy Color, he decided that I should have even more tasks to complete and released the Tadboy Color. The Tadboy Color is exactly what I said at the beginning. He asked, how small can you make a Game Boy Color while keeping the cart slot, while keeping the brains of the operation, and then using new parts for other things? And the answer is basically the size of an iPod Video 5.5. Yeah, but like with a bigger screen. That's crazy, right? And I originally thought I wasn't going to make it, but then my girlfriend saw it and she was like, oh my God, that's so cute. And I said, if I make one, will you use it? And she said, yes. We'll see. But I have to say, as I completed this project, I both never wanted to do it again, but also really wanted one for myself, because the utilization of the aluminum shell and just there's a comfort to it that is rather unexpected. And it's just kind of like a little feat of engineering, a little froggy little miracle. So I want to tell you how you can make it, or at least give you some tips on the process, because as always, consider this a supplement to the GitHub. Consider this just another perspective, and consider this made possible by PCBWay. If you haven't heard about PCBWay, you may be new to the channel, in which case, welcome. But PCBWay has been the reason a lot of these projects have been possible for me, as they've collaborated with me since I was a much smaller channel to create cool Game Boy stuff. PCBWay offers, of course, PCBs, but also CNC machining and 3D printing. So they are perfect for your next project. If you have one, if you don't, there are tons of other creators who have their projects on PCBWay ready to order, such as Chris's Tadboy Color. You can order all of the parts you need. You can get the front, back shell, and volume wheel CNC machined. You can get the cartridge shield and light pipe 3D printed, and you can hit add to cart to get the PCB ordered as well. You can even pick PCB and assembly to have the folks at PCBWay put all those pesky little 0402s on for you. And every time you order a project off of PCBWay's page, the creator does get a small percentage as well, which I think is super awesome. So huge thank you to PCBWay. If you haven't used them before, you can use my affiliate code in the description to get a little discount while also helping out the channel. So with the Tadboy Color, what do you need to get into this? Because yeah, that's what you're doing. You're getting into something. You will need a Game Boy Color to harvest CPU, RAM, and the link port from. You will need a Game Boy Advance SP cart slot, because that's how it's so skinny, is it's using the cart slot from the Game Boy Advance SP instead of the regular Game Boy Color cart slot. And you can buy those off AliExpress for very cheap. Just do a quick test before you install it of inserting and removing a cartridge just to see if it's nice and tight and, you know, does give you a bit of resistance when you're pulling it out, because there have been a couple of people who've gotten some weird ones from AliExpress where the pins just like all fell out, and you don't want to install it and then realize that it is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Like the Frogboy, you will be using Game Boy Advance SP buttons with the brightness button doubling over to be a power button. And the bill of materials for everything else is of course available on the GitHub, and something you will notice is this is very, very largely 0402 components, which is just very micro soldering, very tiny. As someone in my Discord stated, 0402 components are for pick and place machines and not for human hands. So on that note, usually I kind of am on the fence about using PCBWay's assembly service, because if you don't have the capability of assembling a full board yourself, then to get it assembled except for the CPU, RAM, and other harvested parts, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because you are going to be ultimately receiving a board that you don't know how to complete. And that's why I often will recommend someone like Jack V, who does do board commissions, just to do the whole thing for you, because fabricators don't have access to like a ton of Game Boy Colors that they can harvest from and put it together for you. But because these components are so challenging, I think if you just don't feel like it, you don't have the time or the energy, or you've already done your 0402 experience with some other build, just get it assembled. Just get it assembled and add the harvested bits yourself later. I think I'm kind of on the fence about it, but I kind of feel like if I end up building a second one, I will get the board done and then just add the bits myself. You could also get a stencil made for you where you just put it on and just the solder paste. That's also an option. I've never used a stencil, and often I'm like, oh, you know, it would be neat to have a stencil for XYZ. But with this, I'm just like immediately jumping to someone else do it for me. In order to save space, this is a double-sided board. And that means that for things that we usually use a hot plate for, such as CPU and RAM, you won't really be able to, because there's stuff behind it. And so you definitely need hot air for this. Hot air and a soldering iron. You will need tips like a knife tip and or a J-tip and or a very fine conical tip, because everything is quite cramped. So if you want to do touch-ups, you will need something to really get in there. And of course, the hot air is going to be used wherever you would use a hot plate normally. You will also need a microscope. I know there's some of you out there who are insane and will put together like Game Boy Pocket Colors and stuff without a microscope. I don't understand, but you can't do this. You can't do this without a microscope. No, you need a microscope. Get a microscope. It's not that expensive. You can get microscopes for really cheap off like AliExpress. Get a microscope. Otherwise you can't. You need a microscope. And you need to have successful experience with micro soldering before you do this. It doesn't have to be with 0402 components, but you just need to know your way around it. And this is not the best way to learn. This should not be your first rodeo, in my opinion. It can be. Nothing is impossible, of course, but I just don't recommend it. I feel like it'll be very frustrating. In terms of the shell is obviously custom, as is the volume wheel, dial, and the cart slot cover. And of these, the cart slot can be 3D printed, the cart slot cover. The volume wheel and the front and back should be aluminum CNC'd. You could also get polycarbonate CNC, I hear. Some people have 3D printed and resin printed, but I feel like it's a bit like the Gotcha SP in that it doesn't necessarily have like the extent of integrity due to the size and just like the thinness that would be super comfortable in the long run. So I think if you can't afford it, but you really want to make one and just have one, you can 3D print or resin print it. The files for this project are up on GitHub. So people have tried printing it at home as well. It's definitely an option, but it's not the recommended option. With the Froggo Color, for example, there was the option of full resin or half resin, half. You guys, I cannot say this word anymore because I just like have a mental breakdown each time. And half aluminium. But with this, it's like, yeah, you should just the whole thing in aluminium, especially because it is smaller. It is going to wind up cheaper. In terms of finishes, you have with PCBWay, you can do anodized, which there's more limited colors, but it, you know, it's not a coating, and so it's very durable. If you find a color that you like, you can do powder coating and you can do spray painting. And with powder coat and spray paint, you have a vast Pantone library to choose from, and you can do matte or glossy. Now, if you do want to skip the following segment where I talk a bit about my experience with the shells from PCBWay, I just want to throw in here, I highly recommend that if you're not doing anodized, to get powder coat on the shell and spray paint on the volume wheel if you are getting the candy volume wheel, which is what I've dubbed the one with bevels all around it. I use that for my Froggo Color. I just really like it. I think it's neat. It has the fun and whimsy that I think the newer volume wheel lacks, but spray paint just has finer particles, so it can really get in there and fully cover your wheel. But yeah, all that can be ordered from PCBWay directly through the project page. Now, one little quirk that you might experience, who knows, I'm just talking from history, is there has been a bit of a trend of people getting the Tadboy Color shells and them not really being up to snuff. Sometimes there might be burrs, there might be paint job issues, there might be like any number of finish issues, and I really don't know why. I don't know if this has just been an insanely popular project, so they're getting a lot of them, and so speed is being prioritized over precision. But what I do know is everyone who has had an experience where they didn't get what they wanted has been able to get replacements, or in some case, multiple replacements. You know, sometimes we wonder if people on YouTube, or even if we're someone who's an affiliate ourselves, I've wondered, like, am I getting something like special things? But luckily for you guys, I actually also got something I wasn't too happy with on the first round. And so I kind of want to talk about that. Both sides of my powder coated shell had come out poorly, both in terms of the paint as well as the milling, but I reached out and I did get a replacement. And ultimately, I think what really sets a company standard is whether they have good customer service or not, and PCBWay has proved that it does. So let's go ahead, and before we start building this thing, let's just take a look at 3 different sets of shells and volume wheels for the TBC and my experience with PCBWay ordering for the Tadboy Color. And then once we have done that, we can start building the thing, and then we can talk about it. As usual, feel free to use the timestamps and jump around to what's best for you. This is powder coated matte. You can see on the back there is paint missing around the screw holes, and the screw holes just are really rough in terms of the milling, i.e. how they cut the aluminum. Also, interestingly, there's no paint on the inside, which I don't care because you don't see the inside, but it's just interesting because with my Frogboy, they did paint the inside. So not a complaint, but I think it does kind of feel a bit like they kind of took a shortcut and just did it really fast. So that's a bummer. And this is actually the second part that I saw, and I had thought initially, oh, well, at least the back is fine. But the first part that I saw was the front. And with the front, we have really bad milling. I don't know if it's clear on the camera, but the cut out here has a burr. And that's very frustrating. Similar on the back side is that they didn't paint it in. Here, it's not something that you can see, but you can feel it. It's very jagged and sharp. It just feels like they did this in a manner that was very uncared for. And it's also just frustrating because the price of these is quite high for a consumer. If you look here, you can even see that because they didn't paint the edges, it's not a seamless transition. The jaggedness plus the lack of paint, you can see some bare metal. Now, when I brought this up with my marketing rep, the main thing I said was, what I don't understand is why this came out so poorly, where my Froggo Color came out really well. And this has been several months since I made my Froggo Color, and she revealed something to me that I was quite taken aback by and was rather upset that I wasn't informed about earlier. To her credit, of course, she didn't know, but I feel like given that the manufacturing side knew, they should have told me. I will be talking about that in a separate video, not as a way to farm content or something, but I just want to make sure that anyone who may have felt like they were misinformed as a result of this from my videos on the Froggo Color and featuring the Froggo Color is aware that something was wrong. So keep an eye out if you're interested. It's gonna be super, super short. We also have the volume wheel, and the volume wheel, like, I had the literal same thing for the Froggo Color. So I could quite confidently say that it was the manufacturing that was poorly done and not the design. You can see that there's paint missing on the bevels, and also the paint on the front flat surface is very thin, so you can see the metal from behind it. But you know, they did listen to me and not fill the inside of the hole. That was frustrating, but they do make it right, which is very much appreciated. I do want to talk a little bit about a different experience I've had many years ago about how manufacturers don't always make it right. But first, let's cover this. So when they said that they would make it right, they not only offered to redo the powder coat, but they said that they'll send me a spray painted one too, so that I can show you guys and we can compare. So here is the powder coated revision. It doesn't have any burrs, it's not sharp, there's nothing sticking out, and they actually did both sides, which again, it's fine if they hadn't done both sides because the inside you can't see it. However, at least doing the edges so that your seams are not visibly uncolored is ideal. Similarly with the back, they painted both sides, and we can see here our screw holes do not look like they have been violated. So this is beautiful. This is the quality I have come to expect from PCBWay. And then just for kicks, they sent me a spray painted version. And this one also is quite wonderful. No notes. What's interesting, I think, is I feel like while grittier, the spray paint particles are finer than powder coat. So it gets a lot more into the nooks and crannies. Now, the big differences between these two, the spray paint feels a lot, they're both matte, but the spray paint is a lot flatter matte, whereas the powder coat is a smooth matte. The spray paint also has a grainy texture that you can get rid of if you use a polishing cloth or superfine sandpaper, whereas powder coat is wonderfully smooth to the touch. I also am not planning to scratch these up, but I can tell you for a fact that spray paint is going to be more vulnerable to scratches than powder coat. So over time, you know, if you end up scratching it, you know, you hit it with like your keys or I don't know, anything sharp metal, you're gonna get the paint chipped, whereas powder coat is a lot stronger. So from this, obviously, I would recommend powder coat. But something that is interesting is they also redid the volume wheels in both powder coat and spray paint. And this one's the powder coat one. As you can see, they actually did color it fully this time, so it is not missing paint on the top flat area. However, you can see that the parts which are beveled still are missing some paint. But the spray painted one looks really wonderful. It is painted all over, and I think that goes back to spray paint, I believe, having finer paint particles, so it gets into the nooks and crannies. So my recommendation, if you are, like me, a fan of this candy style volume wheel for the Froggo Color or for the Tadboy Color, and you're getting paint, get your wheel spray painted and get your body powder coated. So what have we learned here? We've learned that powder coat is nicer than spray paint forever and in the long run. With spray paint, another time that you can damage it is when you're putting in screws or taking out screws. Just your screwdriver hitting the paint can cause it to be removed. Of course, this is much more durable spray paint than the kind that you might do in your garage, but you know, we're talking longevity. But in terms of very, very small nooks and crannies, spray paint is actually a better idea. We've also learned that PCBWay will make things right. That's also something that they really wanted me to convey to you guys, that they are committed to making the customer happy. So if something comes out wrong, just contact them. One thing that I have heard, and we do have a brief example of, is sometimes when they redo your order, they forget to include your initial note. For example, I asked not to fill the hole in the volume wheel, but as you can see, one of these is filled. This has also been something some people in the Discord have experienced, where their redos are not including the note that they requested in the first iteration, which leads to a third iteration having to be made. And so I think that's definitely a good tip, is to, if you do ask for a redo, just also include a reminder of your original order's notes. Now you might be thinking, and this is incredibly valid to think, isn't this a pain in the butt? You are paying so much and something doesn't come out the way that you expected, either in material, in quality, or both, and you have to keep going back and forth to get it replaced? That doesn't make any sense. And I agree. In a sort of low volume consumer situation, it doesn't make sense. However, you have to consider a few things. First off, we are very small volume customers if we're just ordering one thing. So ultimately, while $100 or more is a lot to us, it's not a lot to a manufacturing company who is receiving much bigger, much more expensive orders. And unfortunately, another thing with bigger, expensive orders is a lot of times they can afford to either get rid of anything that didn't come out perfectly, or sell it at a discount, or whatever. So in a way, we are kind of a weird, unique case. Defending this, I'm just more trying to explain why it doesn't make total lack of sense to me. Before I got into this nonsense, at one point I was manufacturing enamel pins, and I could tell you stories. The thing about pins is they are handmade. These guys also, to an extent, are being done by a human being. And so different human beings have different levels of care, different levels of talent, different levels of consideration. But enamel pins are made by hand, and they're actually illegal to make in the US due to the toxic fumes. And a big reason I stopped making them, other than the absolute pain of manufacturing, was I was like, well, if the fumes are so toxic, we can't make them in the US. I don't want to subject people in another country to the fumes. Like, that's messed up. Because they're made by hand, you would get a lot of errors, and just the same manufacturer could get overwhelmed and start messing up everyone's orders. And again, you know, you are a small business, so maybe you're ordering 50 to 100, whereas a big business is ordering like a few thousand, and also a lot of big businesses are ordering pins for, I don't know, like work events or whatever, as opposed to art pins, which is what we're making. So if the color's slightly off, or if it's a little underfilled with enamel, the business is not gonna care. They're like, this is just a pin for like my employees. So we have very specific wants as pin artists. So that would lead to a lot of issues and so much wasted money and broken hearts in the pin making community, because a lot of manufacturers, instead of actually redoing it or refunding you, would try everything from just making excuses like, this is made by hand, so it's gonna have issues, even though the issue did not happen in your last batch, to trying to get you off their back with like really dumb discounts. Like, okay, well, next time you place a $1,000 order, we'll give you $10 off, which is also dumb because like, if you messed up my order, why would I place another order? All that to say that manufacturing companies are not exactly kind or considerate or really always there for you as an individual consumer who's building stuff either for a hobby or a small business. So that comes back to PCBWay. The fact that they're willing to make things right is a huge distinction from a lot of other companies that work in manufacturing. So my hope is that PCBWay will put more care and consideration into their builds, but ultimately their way of remedying the situation is leagues above a lot of manufacturing companies. And for that reason, I still highly recommend them for their customer service and their attention to the customer. Again, going back to the pin community, there would be people who would get things redone and the redo would be bad in a different way. And at that point, the manufacturer was like, I'm done. We're not redoing them again. And it's like, well, this is your fault. You keep messing up. But PCBWay's offered, you know, I think the most I've seen on the Discord is like 3 or 4 redos for people. So they'll just keep redoing it until it's right. And it takes time, but also, hey, you know, we're all human and therefore worthy of some forgiveness. Anyway, let's put a PCB in here. In terms of harvesting from a Gameboy Color, all you need is the CPU, RAM, and link port. You can get a new link port, you can get new RAM as well, but it's much more economical this way. As usual, my way of getting these IC chips off is just covering the legs in flux and then sitting them on my hot plate. And as it heats up, they will start to remove and you can lift them up with a pair of tweezers. As always, be gentle and only lift when they are ready, otherwise you risk damaging your chip legs, and that is not very good. Next, we can harvest the link port. You'll need a solder sucker for this. If you don't have a solder sucker, this is the only part of the project you need it on, so you can just buy a new one, I guess. But I'm just adding flux and heating it up and then popping off that solder. Once the solder has been sucked, it helps to use this metal spudger to wiggle it off, mainly because the left and right pins are there for stability and they're kind of bent in, so they hold onto the board, so it's helpful to have some leverage. All right, then we move on to the TBC board, and I'm going to reference the guide in this a lot and how I did things differently and how I wish I did things differently. So in the TBC guide, you see that the first thing to do is to attach the tactile buttons. And if you watch Froggo's video, he actually puts all the buttons on except for A, for good reason. However, for my journey, I realized that the buttons had to come at the very end because they just kept getting either dirtied up or damaged or falling off. The main reason to do them first is because tactile switches are easier to place on with a hot plate, because with a hot air gun you will melt them. So it makes sense. However, the board just goes through way too much for me to have had them survive this process. So I just kind of wanted to show you, just to be able to have the chance to give this explanation. This is definitely a project where you kind of have to figure out your own flow, and you ultimately have to make one at least to really get that down, because everyone has their own way of doing things generally, but it's just so much more finicky with this board. And so hopefully I'm just showing you one way to do it, and you can put all these different visuals together and ultimately figure out the best way for you. Now, whether you put the tactile buttons on first or you are on your first step now, we do have to do the power bits first. This is the same as Froggo's guide. The reason for this is because we want to make sure we have power and make sure the power works and we're getting all the right values. So let's go ahead and do that. If you are following along with Froggo's GitHub, this is section 2, power assembly. And we have components both on the front of the board and on the back of the board for power. If you have a keen eye, you may notice that I am putting U4 on incorrectly. The arrow on the bottom left of your screen shows simply where U4 goes, and the dot on the top right of the component is where the dot lines up. Because I covered it in solder paste, I put it on incorrectly initially, but I did flip it around in good time. By the way, another note, I will be doing a lot of reflowing and touching up on this that I won't be showing, simply because it would take forever, because everything needed to be touched up. And I learned a lot from that as well, that I don't know if my usual solder paste technique is the best for the 0402 components. Some folks who do Gameboy modding, they just overall prefer to use solder wire and tin the pads and then place components and hit it with heat from a hot air gun or a hot plate. For me, solder paste is preferable, but with these 0402 components, they're so small and they dance about so much that over time I actually realized that touching with solder wire and then applying heat and cleaning up with an iron might be the best way. But again, that's something that you will have to discover for yourself. Now we're going to install the USB-C port, and here is a tip. The components right above it that I've put down, don't put those down until you are positive that your USB-C port is correctly installed, there's no bridges, and there's no cold joints, and all of the pins are making good contact with the board, because I had to go over it several times and really get in there, and the C11 and F2 components really got in the way. So I recommend getting that seated first. Also, try to get the USB-C port as flat and straight as you can with the board, if that makes sense, because mine ended up having a slight angle, and that caused the select button to kind of sit a little funny. Ultimately, it's not sitting perfectly flush, and that's okay because it's the select button. Who uses that frequently. No one uses it frequently, it's fine. But it is something to keep an eye out for. Not being able to use a hot plate really gives you so much anxiety when it comes to these plastic parts. As I was touching up the USB-C and trying to fix it, I was getting like this plastic melting off, and it just looked like carrot cake to me. I rarely use a J-tip, but it actually came in really handy here because, as I mentioned earlier, the components right above the USB-C are really getting in the way, and I didn't want to remove them, and so this let me just cheese my way in. Once you are done putting your power components together, as usual, Froggo has included a very easy way to test the power. I love it. So you put your multimeter in DC voltage mode, ground goes in the left pin of the link port, and then we can test all the points. All the points should currently be giving you 0 volts while it is off. The only thing that should be reading is the SWVCC, which should tell you whatever the size of your battery currently is. Once turned on, 5 volts should read, of course, 5 volts. 3.3 volts should read about 3.3 volts. And both VCC and SWVCC should read the capacity that is currently in the battery. And make sure you turn it off before you remove the battery. If everything is good, from here we're going to go to the next part of the guide, which is appropriately called the brains of the operation, where we are going to install our RAM, CPU, and the related components. Make sure that both your RAM and CPU are oriented correctly according to the markings on the board. Once the SRAM chip is soldered down and I have gone over it with an iron to clear any bridges, I just go over it with a dental pick and make sure that all of the legs are nice and secure. Not to make you queasy, but I also find it very helpful for legs like this to tilt the board towards the microscope, and that way I can visually inspect any bridges that might be happening further up the legs. I was a little overconfident with the CPU, and I've left this in just so that you can see. The right-hand side is not perfectly aligned, and I haven't noticed it yet. But once I notice it, I'm like, we can make it work. It'll still attach, but unfortunately that is not the case, and I had to pick it back up and place it with much better alignment. Something I wanted to skip to in this step is part 5 in the GitHub, which is the sound. I wanted to install the sound components before installing like the cart slot and everything like the GitHub says, just so that I can make sure that that ding is there. And I also want to clean the board before getting too many big parts on it. And I felt that would just make more sense for my process. gonna flip the board again to work on the amp and stuff related to the sound that is also on the back. After all this, I did not hear any sound, and I realized it is because I completely forgot the crystal. If you look on the GitHub, Froggo does have the area of the crystal highlighted as a place to populate for the brains of the operation, but because he doesn't have the part on it, because I guess it's just not available in KiCad, he didn't include like something to go on top of it. And luckily, I'm not the only one who missed it, so I'm not that silly, but I'm just gonna point out in case you are slightly silly like me. The crystal also has a correct orientation, so be mindful of that. Once the crystal was installed, I did turn it on and I did hear a ding, so I decided to move on to the screen components. This is going to jump us back up to the brains of the operation section, and it's just going to be the ribbon cable connector and a couple of little components beside it. Now this is where things get gross. So this uses a special ribbon cable, not the regular one, and so you use a different connector than the ones that come from Gameboy Color. You'll notice we didn't harvest it. Now Gameboy Color FFC connectors are really sturdy. You can put them on with a hot plate so they don't melt because, you know, plastic, but you can also run over them with your iron in order to clear any bridges, and it's great. So I was gonna do the same thing with this, no problem, right? Problem! Even the gentlest touch of my iron just melted the plastic, and I kind of got mesmerized by it, and I just kept doing it, and it all like kind of fell apart. So don't do that. Luckily for you, this is a video, so everything will happen rather quickly, but I had to wait about 1 or 2 weeks to get a couple of more. And so I do also highly recommend getting at least 2, just in case, because these are way more delicate than OEM or just the type of ribbon cable connector that the regular GBC uses. So let's see how to actually put this FFC connector on correctly. So remember what I said about tinning the pads on 0402 components on this maybe being a better idea? So this is kind of the way to do it for this connector, because there's no way to clean up any extra solder that has come out of your solder paste, or at least not easily. So I'm just going to make sure that each pad is nice and juicy. I'm being very careful because I just don't want any bridges from the get-go. I don't want that to be a challenge that I have to face. Once everything looks juicy enough, but also separate enough that there won't be bridging, I will put flux on top of it so that it doesn't need as much heat in order to melt and attach. Once it's perfectly lined up, I will use my soldering iron to tack the left and or right side down so that it doesn't move, I don't accidentally bump it, and then I will let the hot plate do its work. And pretty much anything you need to do with it any sort of touch-ups. If any of the legs are not on completely, any cold joints, just flux, hot plate, or use your soldering iron tip to just gently touch the tips of the pins. Just don't get any heat near that plastic. It won't survive. Now I'm going to slot in the screen just to make sure that the screen displays and nothing crazy is happening. Be careful with the ribbon cable. I believe Froggo's going to revise it to not be such a stern 90-degree angle, but that 90-degree angle does make it a little prone to tearing if you mishandle it. So just be very delicate with it. But since I'm getting a picture and nothing looks crazy, I'm going to go ahead and complete the screen controls, which is part 6 in the GitHub. For the screen controls, we use select and down. So if you're waiting till the end to solder your tactile switches, then just solder the down one and the select one, and that should be enough. And that way also, if they fall off or something, you haven't lost too many switches. In order to put the screen control bits, make sure you cover the FFC connector with Kapton tape to encourage it not to melt. Once that's done, you can go ahead and test the screen controls, and I did that off screen. And as long as the controls are working, my next step is to go ahead and basically fill out the rest of the board. So any other remaining pieces go on the board now. That is just excluding the cart slot. Here I am assembling the indicator LED circuit. And so D1 is charging, D2 is full battery, and D3 is low battery. Now, be mindful of the LED type that you purchase. The ones that I found with my Froggo Color are ultra bright, so I had to increase the resistor values on that guy to get them to not be so blinding. But with this one, I didn't want to experiment too much given the 0402 components are so challenging to work with. So I just made sure to use friendlier colors, using an amber color for battery, red for low battery, and the green for charging, which is when we're not going to look at it. The nice part of this whole area where the screen stuff is and the indicator LED stuff is there's nothing on the back side, so you can just completely rely on your hot plate for this instead of hot air. let's just test that all of the LEDs are working. We've got our yellow light on. And we've got our charging light green. So I'm just gonna have faith that the red low battery also works. Big shout out to a Discord friend for pointing this out to me before I wrapped everything up. But this probably only applies to you if for some reason you've been sitting on your board for a long time, because it's just an issue with the very first revision of these boards. But you need to add a 22 PF capacitor next to C28. And so that's why I'm scratching off some solder masks so that I can just solder them next to each other. And this is to prevent any unwanted triggering of the brightness controls on the screen kit. But it has been fixed in revisions moving forward, so this is a bit of a niche instance. Now I'm just going to solder on the link port. This is super easy, especially compared to everything we've done so far. It's just a simple through-hole component. I recently bought an ultrasonic cleaner and it has been super helpful. So I'm throwing it in there with some PCB cleaner at 45 Celsius for about 10 minutes. And we'll take a look afterwards. Coming out of it, it's so funny. Like, all of these fell off, the switches, except for that one. It's holding on, but it's clean. It's so clean. I waited, I think, a good 24 hours. Anyway, from there we can put on the cart slot. This is a bit challenging. You have the CPU pins kind of in the way, so you want to cover them with Kapton tape. And then we are going to solder on the Game Boy Advance SP cart slot by hand. A bit like that FFC connector, I'm going to tack on the side before really digging in, just to make sure that it stays on and I don't nudge it and it doesn't end up crooked or anything. The music that you've been hearing has been kindly provided by Joseph Tompkins. Yes, that Joseph Tompkins, the co-creator of the Gotcha SP, among many other things. His info is in the description, so check him out. And if you'd like your songs featured in the background of my long process videos, just send me an email or a message on Discord. Once that's done, just for safety, I wanted to go over the CPU pins again that are on the top, just because the flux was kind of flowing pretty freely under the Kapton tape and, just less than ideal. So just gonna double check. The good thing is that the pins on the cart slot are so far apart and so large compared to everything else that we're working with that I'm not so much concerned about causing any bridges or anything on the cart slot if I were to go fix the CPU. So we're in a decent place. All right, now I'm gonna get these poor little nubs off. I'm just gonna use flux and a hot air gun to pop them off. I'm not too troubled about damaging them considering they're already gone kaput. I just don't really want to get flux stuck in anywhere else, given I literally just cleaned this thing. But I want to show you how I put these switches on by hand. So I tin the 4 pads to be nice and juicy. And then I place the switch evenly, you know, try to get it nice and centered. And then I tack one side just to keep it in place. Next, I put flux on each side, nice and juicy. Try not to get it on the switch itself. Then I hold it down with either a finger or a tweezer, and I touch each side. That way we can make sure that it is nice and flat. See how it just bumped down like that because it was kind of floating. And the part that I tacked, I go ahead and do last. And that's that. It's honestly, especially after you've done all these teeny tiny bits, it's not a terrible bother doing these by hand. They are relatively large switches, and with a microscope, a delicate tip like a knife tip or a J-tip or something like that, and something to hold it down, you are set. And we're going to test that final component that we haven't tried out yet, which is the cart connector. So I've got my flash card in here, and I am going to use the Better Button tester to make sure all of my switches are soldered on correctly. And I'm also going to use 240p Test Suite to make sure that everything screen-wise is good. The color grids on that app are fantastic because you can really see if you are having issues with any CPU legs or FFC connector legs, if the colors are wonky, and if they're not, then you are good to go. Everything looks good, so I'm gonna turn it off, and it is gonna be time to assemble this thing. I waited for the last minute to cut off the excess on the PCB, just because I felt like it gave it more integrity in my little PCB holder to have it. I didn't have to struggle for parts to fit the little clips in. So I'm gonna take that off. I'm going to put the screen in the front shell. I'm not taking the screen protector off yet. I just kind of want to sandwich everything first. Next, we're just going to put in our driver board. And I'm going to put down some Kapton tape just to keep it in place. Our familiar custom-made ribbon goes into the top. This time I managed to pick up the correct speaker that was in the bill of materials. This one is wireless, but I'm going to put some cell phone repair tape on the front so that it stays nice and stuck to the front of the shell. Actually, on that note, the speaker contact points on the PCB, I highly recommend putting Kapton tape on them while you're working, because I did get some solder on mine without really thinking about it, and eventually one day that's gonna oxidize and become unresponsive, and so then you can go back and put more solder on it, or just give up and say let's wire up this speaker. But that is far from today. Next, I'm going to put the buttons in. Don't forget your teeny tiny, minuscule, atom-sized light diffuser. Similar to the Gotcha SP, this is also another build that requires GBA SP membrane trimming, so let's go ahead and do that. Finally, it's PCB time, so we'll slot that ribbon cable into the PCB and then we can fold the PCB over. The screws used for this are M2x3. For the power button, this seems to be kind of it happens to some people, doesn't happen to others. I don't know if it's based on where you get your buttons from, but for me this was also a thing with the Froggo Color where I had to use flush cutters just to trim that dimple in the middle. Don't dig in or anything, just a straight flush cut if you're having fitment issues. Don't forget your cart shield, and this goes right under the little clips that the cart slot has built in. It's time to undress your battery. So you do need to undress your battery in order to have it fit. You'll see that the case actually adds quite a bit of chunk to it. So that just peels off and the battery just pops out, and then you can install it. And you're set. This is all there is to the sandwich, and from here we can just put the back plate on. Finally, don't forget the volume wheel. And here we have it. By the way, if you're wondering, I put the lens on off screen, as I always do. It's the steam method. Run your shower hot, let everything settle down, all the dust, the cat hair, go into the bathroom, and just put the lens on there. And like 9 out of 10 times, it's pretty successful. This was quite the journey between having to wait for revised shells and having to wait for replacement FFC connectors, but it's here, and you know, it's so tiny, and I made this and my girlfriend thinks it's cute. In terms of design, I had asked my girlfriend, and you know, I kind of assumed we were just gonna do a full yellow build, kind of, because she really likes yellow and I associate yellow with her. But, you know, then we kind of got into a discussion. I was like, well, you know, you could have a theme, like if there's a character or something you like. And of course, we ended up with her choosing Miffy, and we used colors that are often used in Miffy artwork. And so we've got this very like primary color block, and it has something very toy-like and yet distinguished at the same time. So I'm pleased with how it came out, she's pleased with how it came out, and I am super tempted to make another, but quickly I just want to reflect on my experience building this and maybe some takeaways that will help you. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I genuinely am like, if I make another one, I don't know if I can do it from scratch. I might have to get it pre-built and then just add the harvested parts onto it, because it's a lot. And of course, well, with precision and a steady hand and everything, it should be perfectly fine. Those little inconveniences can kind of grate on you. And maybe it's just because I do find soldering relaxing usually, that this really pops out at me as particularly unrelaxing. Maybe if you find soldering to be a disturbing activity, this won't be any different for you. But I don't know, I'm on the fence about it, because it's also always good to have practice, right, with these kinds of things. So we'll see if I even make another one. Who knows? The future is a mystery. But I think if I were to make another one, like I said, in the process, I would be using solder wire and tinning the pads and then placing the components on top, because solder paste just was not really doing it, especially because with solder paste, I have a bit of like a fast and loose thing, because, I'm not using stencils and stuff. So it's like, you get it on there and then you clean it up with your iron, but there's so little room for navigation that it's not as freeing as a process as it is with boards that use normal sized components. If I did this again, I would also wait until the end to put the tactile switches on, of course, except for the select and down, which would need to go during the screen brightness test section. And I would also probably try to keep everything clear enough to try to put the USB-C connector on with a hot plate, because that was maybe one of the most challenging parts of it. And then ultimately it ended up a little crooked. So bummer. Also, one thing that I have a question about that I will pose to you, because it remains unanswered despite my mad ramblings in Froggo's Discord. My screen, well, rather her screen, but the screen on the Tadboy Color, it flickers really fast when on a certain shade of blue. So the shade of blue that is the background of Tetris DX, the shade of blue that is the background of the opening screen of the menu, like title screen of Zelda Oracle of Seasons, there's some flickering. And I don't know why. I reflowed the FFC connector, I've reflowed the power circuitry, I have checked all the legs on the CPU and reflowed the top legs, which are in charge of color, and it persists. And as you guys saw, I'm getting all the right voltages and stuff, so I have no clue what it is. My next plan of action is when Froggo restocks the ribbon cables to get a new one and swap them out and see. But I don't know. I don't know what I would do next. And the reason it's a slightly mad rambling is because it's not something that I can record due to how quickly it flickers. And so I can't record that and share it on the internet. And the other reason is that when I asked my girlfriend, do you see this flickering? She's like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I've put it side by side with my Gameboy Color that has the same CGS Cloud Game Store screen, and it doesn't do that. So it's not in here. If you have any ideas, feel free to throw them at me, because I will consider them. Because if a new ribbon cable doesn't fix it, then I'm kind of like, because it's not the screen either, because I did try the screen that I use in the video. If you were like, oh man, she's being rough with that screen, that's like my junk CGS screen. That's my tester screen. I don't know if any of us explicitly buy a screen to be a tester screen, but I think we kind of end up with one after messing up at some point and getting it kind of gross. And we're like, okay, guess this is the tester screen. Another takeaway I have from this is kind of putting myself on the other side of things, where a big reason that I initially was like, I don't know if I want to make one, is because it's vertical, and the Gameboy Color is already vertical, and it doesn't seem very ergonomic compared to the Froggo Color, which seems very ergonomic. And so for all of you who look at some of the things I showcase and are like, that looks uncomfortable. Well, I said that looks uncomfortable. And in fact, it's actually quite comfortable. So give things a chance. Sometimes the comfort comes from the joy of using something. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this was helpful and can give you some tips on your next TBC build or your first TBC build. A huge thank you to PCBWay for helping me bring this project to life and for helping me bring so many projects to life. They are absolutely wonderful in their support for this channel, and I'm excited to bring you even more stuff with their help. A big thank you, of course, to Froggo for making this, and for anyone who gave me tips or help or assistance along the way of my own build. Let's go communities who help each other out. Thank you to Joseph for letting me use his music. Please give him a follow on the relevant platforms which I have put in the description, and listen to his sick beats. And finally, a big thank you to my Ko-fi supporters, subscribers, members, one-off donations. All of that is extremely helpful. Go straight to the channel, and with the new membership tier, I will be providing more content, videos, reviews, thoughts, showcases. Let me know what you'd like to see here and there. And don't forget, if it's your first time using PCBWay, I've got an affiliate link that will also super help while you are going to subject yourself to a tiny 0402 building. I have been and will continue to be your cool Uncle Marissa, and don't forget that you are always welcome at Cool Uncle's house, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye!